everyone. Today, my guest is Professor Tom Beckers. He's a professor of psychology at KU Leuven. His work focuses on processes in learning and memory in children and adults. He's using rodents to investigate these. And he has a strong interest in the role of learning and conditioning in phobias, anxiety, addiction, and ADHD. I hope I got this description right.
Sounds fair.
Yeah?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Beckers, for joining in for this episode.
You're welcome.
And so you work with animal models, an area that I'm not super familiar with, so I think it'll be interesting to know more about it for me as well. So I can start with my first question. How long have you been in academia since your bachelor's degree?
Let me think. My bachelor's degree dates back from, I think, 1995. So that would mean close to 30 years now.
30 years?
Yeah, almost, right.
Yeah, that's a long time.
That is a long time.
Yeah.
I'm feeling old instantly now. Thanks.
And before choosing academia, what were the other options that you were considering? And why did you choose academia? So, in other words, did you choose academia or did academia choose you, in a sense?
I'm not certain that it's either of those two options.
Yeah.
Academia definitely didn't choose me. Did I choose academia? Not very consciously either, I think, in the sense that I was that very typical small kid who, when asked what he wanted to be later, he said, I want to be a professor. Not the kind of professor that I've become eventually, I would say, but the kind of professor you find in comic books who knows everything about everything and who invents stuff and saves the world and those things. That was my chosen career path, I think, when I was a little kid. And I must say, when I started in psychology, it was also not with the intention of becoming a clinical psychologist ever. Unlike many people who start on a bachelor's degree in psychology because they want to be able to help people, I've always wanted to just try and figure out why people do the things they do, not necessarily help them.
Okay.
Also because I felt, as a teenager at least, I felt that I would be utterly incapable of helping people. I didn't trust my own personal skills very much. So I've always been inclined to go for research. Already in the first years of the bachelor's, that was what I wanted to go for. And so I've never really hesitated, and I've never had. I've been very lucky along the way, always. So I've never really had to doubt up until the point where I was a postdoc, at least. So the PhD position came very naturally, and also the postdoc came quite easily, I must say. I got a fellowship from FWO to be a postdoc, and I had 2 terms of those. And it was only at the end of my second postdoc that it looked like there was nothing after that. So I actually did start applying with pharmaceutical companies and the like.
Okay.
It didn't look like there was any career prospect for me at that point. But then, out of the blue, I got an email from someone at University of Amsterdam where they were looking for an assistant professor, and I went to talk to her, and we immediately struck an agreement, and so I ended up in Amsterdam. And that was that rescued my academic career, let's say.
So they reached out to you for
they
the position.
I mean, it was, and again, it was chance and luck.
Yeah.
There was someone else working there whom I knew very well, and at some point, you can't imagine in these times, but at that point, they all of a sudden had money that they had to spend. And so they were like, we better invest this now, because otherwise the university will take it back from us. And so they all of a sudden quickly needed to hire an assistant professor. And then through that mutual acquaintance, that I was on the market in the sense that I didn't have much prospect at that point. And so that's how it happened, without a formal job vacancy or anything like that.
Yeah. But after the postdoc, you had interest in like continuing in the research you were doing, or was it like
absolutely.
I can do other stuff as well?
No, I've never really known what I could do outside of this this niche of professional life. I must say.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So this will be an interesting question after that. But did you face any obstacles in your career at all?
Really very few, I must say, and so in that sense, and I profoundly realized that I've been really very very lucky in that regard. That's far from obvious, and I think if I just look at the breaks that I've had, looking back on it all, I realized that at least 80% of it is luck, and perhaps 20% of it is talent. But I've seen a lot of really talented people not get jobs in academia, even if they wanted to. So I've been really fortunate.
Okay. And how has been your journey so far in terms of your field of interest? Like, did you more or less stay in the same broad topic? Did you have like a radical shift at some point?
A radical shift, I wouldn't say, but it has changed a bit over the years, in the sense that for my PhD and also as a postdoc, I was very much into very, very basic science of animal learning. So this was really about models of associative learning and how they worked in humans and in animals, and theories of associative learning. And without much applied interest at all. And I think that only started shifting when I moved to Amsterdam, where I got an assistant professor position in a clinical psychology group, where they were interested in this expertise in associative learning. But the kind of questions that they were dealing with were questions of anxiety, phobias, things like that. And so in this environment, it was very natural for me to gradually shift my interests a bit more to the, not really the applied side, but at least the question of how learning and memory, not just work in general, but how they might play a role in psychopathology, in anxiety, in addiction, in other things that people struggle with.
Okay. And you were in close like collaboration with like clinical psychologists there, or?
Actual clinical psychologists, not so much, but at least with people who had been trained much more than me in clinical psychology. Because I'd done a research master. Well, it wasn't called a research master, but here in Leuven, I had done the predecessor of the research master. I had a few clinical courses, but very few. I was really not trained clinically at all. And so in Amsterdam, I ended up in an environment where many of the people working there were actually clinical psychologists by training, who had then gone into research, or in parallel had also developed research interests, but who were very much clinically oriented and clinically trained. And that inspired my thinking also.
Okay, yeah. And what research questions are you currently trying to explore, and why is this problem important for you?
Well, there's a few. Much of the research that we do these days still has to do with fear and anxiety, and trying to understand why it is that some people develop fears, anxieties, under certain circumstances, whereas others do not, and how you can get a handle on those issues using models of learning and memory that in principle are general purpose models. If you think about theories of Pavlovian conditioning, for instance, those are theories about how the average person learns about things in the environment, including threats in the environment. And so these are actually very much models of adaptive behavior. And so if you want to try and use these theories and models to get a grasp on less adaptive behavior, like you see sometimes with people who suffer from anxiety, for instance, then you can get only so far with these models. And so an important question then becomes, how do you fit individual differences there? How can you understand individual differences from the perspective of these models, if we really think that learning and memory are important in understanding these problems that people have.
Okay. And in terms of those individual differences, are you more focusing on like the biological differences or?
Not so much. We're actually more interested in on the one hand personality differences. So traits, stable traits that might explain part of it, and also just learning history and how that might shape learning and memory in the here and now. So the experiences that people have had in the past, sometimes fairly innocuous experiences, but potentially also traumatic or very stressful experiences, and how those experiences might then shape later learning and later memory processes.
Okay. And a question that I wanted to ask was this, that you said that you didn't have much experience in the clinical psychology, but then you came into contact with other researchers who were experienced there. Do you now like see the need here and there, like now and then, to be in contact with them and like get more perspective from the clinical world, or are you more into like basics of the research?
No. I do think that that's important. Now I have the good fortune that in Amsterdam I not only got into touch with those kinds of people, but I also met my wife, who is also a clinical psychologist by training, and so we have a lot of discussions on the train coming into work, or in weekends, evenings, on how these things, how clinical perspectives and clinical experience can influence how you think theoretically about certain problems. So I'm very fortunate to have that inspiration close by.
So you kind of have a consultant at your home.
I have a consultant at home, yes. Yep.
That's nice. And she's working on clinical psychology, right?
She's working in the same faculty here as a professor of clinical child psychology. And her main topic of expertise is ADHD. But so we've had joint research projects on the role of associative learning processes in ADHD, for instance, where she brings her expertise in ADHD, but also in behavior therapy and in how you apply principles of learning in an applied context. And I have this whole basic associative learning and memory background, and so that's a very fruitful combination for us.
That's nice. Because I also had another question, like, do you think about your research when you go home? Like, or is it just...
It happens. It happens, yeah. I mean, it's hard to avoid if you're both in the same job every once in a while. Although, I mean, I wouldn't say that we talk science all the time at home. Far from. Yeah. But it happens, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Another question I had was like, if you had all the funding and resources in the world, what would you try to answer, explore?
Whew, that's a big question. If I had all the funding resources in the world, I'm drawing blanks. I don't know immediately. I think there is one thing that I would really like to try and answer, and it's actually one of the things that I want to move my research into eventually. So I've done research on fear and anxiety for the last more than a decade, but I actually want to move into something else in Pavlovian compensation, which is has to do with how principles of learning and conditioning are involved in drug tolerance, drug addiction, drug craving. And the funny thing is, there is a whole literature on this topic that dates back to the 1950s at least. It's been a very, very active area of research for several decades. But it's almost all animal research. Very strong theories, very rich empirically, but it hasn't had much of an influence on human psychology somehow. And the funny thing is that these theories, these models of Pavlovian compensation, sometimes make predictions that go directly against everything we think we know about placebo effects, including conditioned placebo effects. And so placebo theory often makes the exact opposite predictions as this theory on Pavlovian compensation. Now, the funny thing is, placebo research is almost exclusively done in humans. And so the easy solution would be to say this Pavlovian compensation stuff happens in animals and conditioned placebo effects happen in humans. I don't think that that's the case. I think it has to do with how these things are tested in animals versus humans and under what circumstances. But it's two literatures that don't talk to one another. Two research traditions that are actually relevant for the very same things, but there's hardly any interactions between them so far. And so one of my ambitions is to bring these two literatures together and try and solve the puzzle of how they can coexist. And so that's one of my goals going forward. So if you give me a lot of money, that's what I'll invest in. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. And like you clearly had done a lot of like research and reading on these, while at the same time like conducting your own research, right? So I was wondering like that it's also like a personal curiosity, I'm assuming, right?
It's a personal curiosity. It's also born in part from the fact that I first taught a course on addiction in Amsterdam. As part of my teaching assignment. I wasn't doing anything on addiction, but I was given this assignment, and so I got into that literature a bit then. And then when I came back to Leuven, I was asked to teach psychology to the students in pharmaceutical sciences. And so I've been doing that for like more than 10 years now. And this is a topic that's very relevant for pharmacy and for people in pharmacy. And so I've been reading up on the topic ever since. And then placebo effects, of course, are also really relevant for pharmacists. And so that's how all those ideas started fermenting in my mind.
Yeah. Because I was always curious, like when you're writing a grant or like coming out with a proposal, with a project, where all of these like ideas come from, because it's like both of them are like big literatures that you're talking about, and like you're thinking of like linking them and all that. So it's really like a creative process, but at the same time it comes from experience as well. So
yeah, it is a creative process, but you can of course force the process a bit by diving into a literature, and often the direct cause for doing so is you stumble upon something that's intriguing.
Yeah.
It can be a talk at a conference. It can be something just you read in a newspaper, or a colleague tells you about a certain phenomenon, and you get intrigued, and then you read a bit, and you read a bit more, and then you get sucked into a hole if it's sufficiently interesting.
Yeah.
It's one of the most fun aspects of the job is toying around with ideas. It's often more interesting than actually having to execute them.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, I mean, once you start trying to implement those ideas in actual experiment, I mean that's also fun. But of course, it always turns out that ideas are less easily tested than you would like them to be. There's always practical things that come in. And I mean, real life is so complex that there's always multi-determinism of whatever you're studying. So even if you have really interesting questions in your mind that you would like to get a clear answer on,
it's not always
Mother
possible.
Nature seldomly lets you get an easy answer.
True.
Yeah.
Okay, and more moving on to like your general opinions and ideas about academia. What do you think has changed the most in academia since you started? Like in terms of, I don't know, education, maybe like the quality of articles, the grant proposal process.
There's a lot of things that have changed, I think, for better and for worse. I think one of the things that has probably changed for worse, definitely if I compare to the time when I was a PhD student, I think with the track record that I ended with at the end of my PhD, I would never have been able to make a career these days in terms of the pressure that there is now to produce output, to have papers written and to have all these boxes that you can tick. I think it's far bigger now than it was when I was a PhD student. And I don't think that that's all bad, to be clear. I think PhD students now also get trained in a much more formal way than I was. There is much more attention to the kinds of experiences that they should have had and what kind of training they should be receiving. I think supervision is typically much more structured and more intense now, which sometimes somewhat reduces, I think, the room for creativity and definitely also the room for making errors. But I think does result in better trained PhD students with more skills and who have reflected on more different things, I think, by the end of their trajectory. So that's definitely a plus. But I think the pressure is much higher also. And I mean, it was already challenging to get a job in academia back then, and I've had a lot of luck, but it's even more difficult now, I think, because the number of PhD students has risen to a far greater extent than the number of permanent positions has risen, which also increases the pressure on professors a lot for supervision and all those things. So I think that that's one big change. I think another big change, and I think that that's a change for the better, definitely in the last 10 years, I think, is that we are far less naive about statistics and data analysis and proper ways of doing science than I was. And so I think we sometimes did science in a way that with the eyes of today, I think, I mean, there's this whole discussion about questionable research practices. I think if I would look back to some of the work that I did a couple of decades ago, I definitely would do some things differently. And I'm also pretty confident that some of the findings that I thought were legit and robust at the time probably wouldn't hold up if I would look at them again with the eyes of today. So I think that that's a massive improvement. At the same time, I think the degree of fraud hasn't become less, quite to the contrary. But I think we have a much better understanding of what it takes for science to be robust and replicable. That doesn't mean that science is achieving the goal of being robust and replicable already now, I think, but at least we know what we have to be doing, and people have a much better grasp of this than we had a few decades ago, I think. And so in that sense, I'm moderately optimistic that the robustness of our science is improving.
Okay. Yeah. And also like the number of publications, right, is also increasing. The
number of publications is also increasing, but that's not necessarily helping for the robustness of the science. I think at some point it's hard to say. I mean, of course, the number of publications increases in part just because the number of people doing research increases, and so that's I think good. Provided that the research that people are doing is indeed credible and useful in whatever way you want to think of useful. I don't mean necessarily in an applied way, but so that's good. But of course, the fact that each of those individuals is also producing more and more output and more papers is not necessarily always a good thing, I think, because it often stands in the way of doing thoughtful science, robust science, good science, useful science. And there I'm moderately hopeful that we might be over the peak of this drive for quantity. Because I think slowly also the incentive structures are changing. And perhaps not as much as they should have yet, but I mean, if I have one piece of advice for young people starting, it would be really that if you do science, it's important to reflect on what your values are and to then make those values your priority. So think about what you find important in science and live by that standard rather than trying to optimize for reward from the outside world, because because I think incentive structures can change. And so you might be doing what you think is the most beneficial in terms of career now, but it may well turn out that in 5 years' time that's not optimal anymore. And of course your values can also change, so it might also be that what you do now will not perfectly align with your values in 5 years, but at least you will know that you have done them because you believed in them at that time. And that's going to feel better than having tried to game the system to maximize your own benefits, and then figuring out 5 years later that was not actually wise to do.
That's a really good advice. Wise advice, I'd say.
Yeah.
Okay. And another question I had was like, do you have like a favorite researcher? Is there anyone that you look up to or looked up to during your PhD years or now?
There's a lot of people that I look up to, science-wise. I've been really fortunate in that some of the people that were my supervisors in various stages of my career were people that I look up until this day, look up to very much, and for various reasons, but definitely as scientists. My PhD advisor was Jan de Houwer, who is a professor of psychology in Ghent. He's one of the most clever and also original thinkers in psychology that I know.
Wow.
So that's really been a privilege to have had him as a PhD supervisor, and also one of my postdoc advisors, Ralph Miller, is such a force of nature. So those are people who've really shaped, I think, me as a scientist, as an academic. There's also other people in the field, in the broader field that I work in, that I admire a lot for various reasons. I think one of the fortunes that I had was that I stumbled into a field as a PhD student where egos were not very big, or at least that's always been my feeling. And so you could disagree with people about theories, about things, even on a very fundamental level, and still have very friendly relations with people. And you could write papers arguing against people's positions, and you would still meet them at conferences, and they would turn out to be really super nice people. And that's true to this day. Some of the people that I've had the most friendly relations with in my field are people that I've disagreed with profoundly in terms of the science, which I think is really, really nice.
It's really nice. Do you think that it has changed a bit now, or?
I think it depends really on field and subfield in psychology.
True.
And probably, what helped probably is that the field that I started in as a PhD student was a field that was perhaps dying out a bit, or at least it was not a field that was big on hype, and it was not the field that all the young people were flocking to or something. And so that, I guess, might make a bit of a difference. The people who would be willing to go to stab other people in the back probably chose other fields to work in.
Okay.
Yeah, so it helps to be in a field that is not subject to a lot of hype, I think.
Okay. But it's like you said, learning and memory, that's how you started, right?
Yeah, but it was not just learning and memory in general. It was very much old school conditioning.
Ah, okay.
So the animal learning field, which is a very niche field.
True.
The
Okay, I see.
people who make these little models about associative learning and this is a field that has been massive. It's where people like Skinner and Pavlov founded the field, and it's been big even still in the 1970s, 1980s. But then at one point, all the money in that field was in neuroscience.
Yeah.
And so many of the big shots moved more and more into the neuroscience, and the purely behavioral associative learning stuff became less and less trendy.
And you were there.
And I was there, and not a lot of egos were there, so that was actually really nice. A very safe space to be in as a PhD student and as a postdoc.
Yeah. Okay.
To illustrate, ever since I was a young academic, from the very first review that I ever did for a paper, I've signed them all. I've never done an anonymous review of someone else's papers. And I just copied what I saw my supervisor do, actually, because he also signs all his reviews.
You had the chance to sign the review? Or
Yeah. So if you do
didn't know.
If you do a review for a journal, most people do that anonymously, but you can just put your name
at the
bottom, right?
Okay. Yeah,
and I've always done that. And I think that's something that, as a young researcher, it's not necessarily a wise thing to do, I think. And I could do that because I was in a field where the egos were not too big and where you would not be killed for providing commentary on someone else's work.
True. Yeah, that's a nice illustration.
Yeah.
And moving on to more your work life, what is your typical day and week look like?
A typical day and week.
Yeah.
I'm not certain that there is a typical day and week, but let's try to get close. I think Monday, Tuesday, I'll be typically here in my office, and a lot of my Mondays and Tuesdays are filled with talking to my PhD students. So I see all my PhD students individually, as a general rule, every week, and we talk about their plans and progress and research, and we have a bit of a lab meeting also. And so that's a lot of what Monday, Tuesday is. And then in between is a lot of the stuff that I have to do, as I'm in charge of international affairs for the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences. And so that comes in between also. But that's what I do mostly on those days. And then on Wednesday, I try to work from home. For quite a bit during Corona and after, I had parental leave on Wednesdays. Thanks to the youngest kid, I could take parental leave, but I actually took it mostly for my older kids. And so I've kept the habit of working from home on Wednesdays as far as possible. It's not always possible, but if I can, I do that and really try to get some work done. Try not to have too many meetings then on Wednesdays online, but just try to read papers. I've also just become an associate editor for Psych Science, and so I try to do most of that work also on Wednesdays. And then on Thursdays, Thursdays is my biggest teaching day. So Thursday is mostly teaching, particularly in the second half of the year. There's also teaching on other days, but I also teach, for instance, in the Advanced Research Methods course.
I remember.
But that's much more flexible in a way, because a lot of that is small group assignments, and you just plan it with the students, and it can be Tuesday one week and Wednesday another week. But my classes in the second semester are mostly on Thursdays, and then Friday is a bit mixed. That's probably the most variable day in my agenda, the Friday, but it's the one other day in the week that I might be working from home if I don't have things to do that have to be done.
And it sounds like you're doing a lot of like administrative work and helping your PhD students at the same time, but you still have research projects in your mind, which means that you will still have some time to read stuff and like think
Hardly.
about stuff.
Yeah, not quite as much as I would like to. And that's a challenge, because I want to develop this new idea on Pavlovian compensation and conditioned placebo. But it's so different from everything I've done so far that in order to be able to write a good grant proposal, for instance, to get this funded, I should really have some good pilot data. And so I try to collect some pilot data with master thesis students and the like, because none of this is part of any of my PhD students' projects, clearly. So I try to get it done through various ways and means to get some pilot data, and then hopefully one day write a grant proposal and get this off the ground. But it's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. And one of my last questions, can you suggest one paper from your field that should be read by students who are interested in your field, so that I can put it on the description of the podcast and people can read it?
I think what I would suggest, I mean, there's so many papers you could suggest, and very highbrow or very complicated or very state-of-the-art papers. But I think what I would suggest is that people Google the paper that's called the 4 Loko effect.
4 Loko?
Yeah.
Okay.
4 like in the number 4, and Loko just Loko. It's a paper, it's written by Shep Siegel, who is the guy who did a lot of this Pavlovian compensation stuff, and he's a really good writer actually, and he's done a lot of really interesting research in science, but he also has a gift for science communication, and so he's really written several really nice papers that illustrate these principles in very real life situations. And so one of his papers is this paper on the 4 Loko effect, which is a paper on a phenomenon that on college campuses throughout the States, students were getting very, very drunk, and a lot of accidents happened from drinking a beverage that was called 4 Loko, and it's an alcohol-containing energy drink in a way. So it has a lot of alcohol, but also a lot of caffeine, and a lot of incidents happened on campuses around the States, and people were puzzled by why this was, because the alcohol content was not excessive. I mean, it was like most alcoholic drinks, and still people seem much more intoxicated from this than from equivalent amounts of alcohol that they would drink in the form of beer or something. And people developed theories about how it had to do with interactions between the alcohol and the caffeine, and none of that really made much sense. And so Shep Siegel wrote a paper to explain how all of this might just be due to very psychological mechanisms to do with Pavlovian compensation. And that's a really accessible paper, and that's how you can get sucked into this Pavlovian compensation stuff.
Okay.
The 4 Loko effect. It's a short paper. It's like 3 pages or something in, I don't know, current directions in psychologial science or something. One of these APS journals, I think.
All right.
It was published in maybe 1-2 decades ago. But it's a gem of a paper.
All right. Because when you say like Pavlovian compensation, I'm sure that it will, to some people, it will sound like...
No, nobody knows what that means.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. But
I didn't know
it's
either.
really, it goes back to very elementary principles of Pavlov's dog. So it's really about classical conditioning, but then with a twist. And that twist explains potentially a lot of things that have to do with drug abuse, drug tolerance, also tolerance to pharmaceutical drugs, also heroin overdose. In all of those things, psychology might play a much bigger role than we typically think. And this theory explains why.
Okay.
And there's a lot of evidence to back it up, actually.
All right. Yeah, you sparked an interest in me, so I
You're
think
welcome.
yeah. So yeah, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to do this interview, and I learned a lot. And yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Good luck with the rest of the series.
Yeah, thank you.